Putin has effectively maneuvered the country, into a very uncomfortable and indeed unsustainable position. So Trump, may not be the best informed person when it comes to, analyzing Russia's capabilities, but I think he instinctively feels, politically, Putin's got a problem here. So surely he would like to get out of this mess, and I've given him a chance to do that. So why is he not doing it? So I think he's now, having to encounter some harsh reality here.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by John Lough, Head of Foreign Policy at the new Eurasian Strategies Centre. John, thank you very much for joining us today.
Good afternoon. Great to be with you.
Well, we've heard a bit of a change in tone from Donald Trump overnight for us late on in the US time yesterday, saying he is going to send more weapons to Ukraine, despite the pause announced by the Defense Secretary last week. What should we make of Trump's comments?
The first thing I would say is that we can see that Trump is getting frustrated with Putin, that he understands that his high hopes of delivering a quick deal in Ukraine have just not been achieved. And he's pushed the Ukrainians as hard as he possibly can. And he's now up against the fact that Putin really doesn't want to play ball. Putin wants to fight to the point where he can impose a settlement on Ukraine. Effectively, he can force Ukraine to simply capitulate. And I think it's reached a point where Trump really can't play along with that. He's given Putin an extraordinary amount of flexibility. He offered him essentially an excellent deal back in February and said, look, keep the territory that you've got. Ukraine will never join NATO. There'll be no US boots on the ground. And why don't you just wrap up this whole thing? And for some reason, Putin didn't think that was enough. And maybe he fears the fact that there'll be some sort of rump Ukraine left, which will be supported by the West, including by the United States, and that it will continue to represent a problem for Russia. Indeed, it might even try to fight to reclaim territory. So he seems to simply want to finish off Ukraine. Putin believes that the summer offensive that the Russian army is currently conducting is clearly going to bring some bigger results than it has in recent years, or their efforts to advance have done in recent years. And it is true the Russian army is advancing, but it's advancing very slowly and still at enormous cost. And there's no indication yet that the Ukrainians are going to buckle. But if you think of the massive airstrikes carried out on Ukraine over the last couple of weeks, there's definitely a concerted effort here, in my view, to demoralize the Ukrainian population. At the end of the day, it's armies that fight battles and it's countries that fight wars. So if you can demoralize the population to the point where people really don't want to carry on, then you've got a good chance of inflicting a military defeat on that country. But I think Ukraine is a long way away from that. And if we've learned anything over the last 3.5 years, it is that the Ukrainians are regularly underestimated, both by the Russians and I think also by their Western allies.
And regardless of those comments from Trump, US support has been limited now. There are reports that there may actually be this shortage of Patriot missiles that it was originally put down to. What can the US do if it finds itself in that situation where there is just too much demand?
Well, they're going to have to ration the supply. That's for sure. They are no doubt trying to step up production. And I think they will try to get the European allies to also supply whatever air defense assets they have available. And here, to give them credit, the Germans have been, in fact, doing a great deal. And you don't need Patriot missiles to shoot down everything. To shoot down ballistic missiles, I understand, is a lot easier if you have a Patriot anti-missile system. So we will just have to see what the US can do. You're absolutely right. They have to live within their limits. But what's interesting here is that Trump, I think, has changed his tune. And it seems that the relationship with Zelensky that we know just veered drastically off course back in February, and we witnessed that with that ghastly Oval Office meeting. It seems somehow to be back on track, and they are finding a common language. Zelensky referred to the fact that the most recent call he had with Trump was, in fact, the most productive so far. In The Hague, I don't know if you spotted this, but at the press conference at the NATO summit, Trump took a question from a BBC journalist, a Ukrainian woman, who told him that her husband was on the front and described her personal situation. Trump was clearly touched by this story, and there isn't much that's moved him on Ukraine at all up to this point. Maybe something in his mind is shifting slightly. So he seems to have disagreed, at least for now, with the policy adopted by the Department of Defense to effectively cut off, well, one might say suspend military supplies to Ukraine. And Trump claims that this hasn't happened, it isn't going to happen. But obviously the most important priority for the Ukrainians at the moment, beyond the provision of intelligence data, which the Americans are responsible for, is to try to plug this gap in the air defenses. It's not clear how much longer Russia can sustain an air assault on this scale. They're probably burning through whatever supplies they have at a rapid pace. So to what extent they can resupply, we're going to probably find out in the coming weeks. But I think it's fair to say the Ukrainians are bracing themselves for a lot more of this.
There is a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing this week on Thursday. Is there more European allies could do to supply a sort of stopgap?
I'm sure there's more the Europeans can do, but let's keep in mind that, and the UK is a good example of this, the cupboard is bare after 3+ years of supporting Ukraine. But I think there are other countries that are perhaps in a better position. Poland is probably one of those. As I said before, the Germans are doing a lot more and are stepping up their efforts. So this will probably be an effort also to persuade the Americans, the Europeans, are actually prepared to buy these things from the US for Ukraine. And it seems the Ukrainians, if needed, are also prepared to buy them. So that's adds a big incentive. But to ramp up, as far as I understand, ramp up production of some of these anti-missile systems takes a great deal of time. And what we're learning during this war is that Western countries really don't have that defense industrial capacity to respond quickly to demand of this kind. So this is, I think, a real wake-up call for Ukraine's Western allies, that this is a different type of warfare, and we're simply not equipped for it. My suspicion, however, is that a combination of the US continuing to do what it can and the Europeans stepping up to the extent that they can, is that Ukraine will still be in a position to continue to fight this war, probably for a good time yet. So we're not at that point where the Ukrainians are desperately running out of things. But if we don't step up and respond to their needs, we could reach that point quite quickly.
And that meeting of the Coalition of the Willing was called in part after Zelensky had this reportedly pretty good phone call with Donald Trump last week, following a phone call with Putin, which didn't go as well. What do we know about what that meeting could be about? Is there a sign that something could be announced here, or that there may be another development there after that phone call with Donald Trump?
I don't think so. And I suspect that we're just at the point where the Europeans are going to rally together to give Ukraine that combination of political, economic, and military support that it needs to get through this next stage of the war. And this is really important for countering whatever demoralization of the population that might be happening at the moment as a result of this extreme level of bombardment, and also the fact the country's been at war now for effectively 3.5 years, and people are exhausted, and somehow they have to find the extra reserves to carry on. So what I find, even just talking to Ukrainian friends and contacts over recent weeks, is that people are just reassured to know that somebody from outside understands their predicament, and that some of our countries are really trying to do things to help Ukraine. This is massively important. So we faced this situation 12 months ago that we've got to get Ukraine through the summer, and then we have to get Ukraine through the winter. And I fear that it's going to carry on like this for a good while yet. And let's see what President Trump ultimately decides to do. He's given the Russians a real fright, not in Ukraine, but over Iran. They did not expect him to move forward at such speed and bomb Iran. This was a president, after all, who campaigned on an anti-war ticket, claimed the United States was getting drawn into conflicts far from its borders in which it had no interest. And then, within a matter of months, he takes the side of Israel and does something, one has to say, extremely brave in terms of bombing Iran. This was not without serious risk. And there's a possibility he may have to do it again if the strikes so far have not inflicted sufficient damage. So I think for the Russians, this was something really unexpected. And it's having all sorts of regional consequences for them. So Trump, they've always known that he's unpredictable, mercurial, but to this degree. So could it possibly be that he'll just turn the table upside down and say to Putin, you know what, I gave you a chance, you didn't take it. And the only way forward for me is to give the Ukrainians more support. And I didn't want to do it, but you put me in this situation. So do you want to have a think again? That might be the tactic that he adopts. But everything so far, in his record, nevertheless suggests that he doesn't want confrontation with Russia. During his first term, he seemed to, at every turn, resist the introduction of sanctions, and there were quite a few sanctions adopted on Russia during his first term. And he always seemed to be trying to sort of smooth the way for the next conversation with Putin. So I'm not aware in the past, though, that he's responded to a media inquiry by saying, I didn't have a good conversation with Putin. This is new. Up to now, according to John Bolton, the former national security advisor during Trump's first term, who's often on your programs, Trump seems to think that Putin, is his friend and tries to nurture the relationship accordingly. Just maybe he's reaching the end of the road there. So Putin, to preserve that perception on Trump's part, was going to have to pull out some rabbit out of the hat. But I really don't see what that is at the moment.
Well, yes, and is there a risk here that Trump has slightly backed himself into a corner in that he's issued a lot of these threats to the Kremlin and to Putin about, come to the table or else, and yet hasn't followed up on them with any significant pressure really on Russia. And now he, like you say, he admits his last phone call hasn't really made any progress. Are the Kremlin going to believe anything but hard action at this point?
Probably not, and it's probably to Trump's advantage that Lindsey Graham in the background there is, assembling votes in the Senate, and he seems to have quite a lot of support for the, radical sanctions package that he's proposing that would put, 500% tariffs on countries that are, so effectively supporting Russia in this war by, buying its oil and gas and whatever, but. That's just very hard to imagine that Trump would want to take that sort of turn with the Russians. But I think he might well have to indicate now more forcefully that he is prepared to do things, and maybe this Graham bill is just he's kind of set a hair there that can start to get the Russians a little bit unnerved that they have underestimated him. Could he really do this? And then of course stop short of it. But he's never really up to this point, I feel, threatened Putin with seriously punitive measures, because all the time he's felt that he just has to sort of cajole him to the negotiating table, make a few concessions, then Putin will see the light of day and want to negotiate an end to this war. Because where I think Trump is right is in his instinct that this war is actually painful for Russia as well, that there is a logic for Putin to bring this to an end. Sure, he can carry on fighting for a good while yet. He has the resources to do that. But the economic damage that's being done to the country as a result of sanctions, and sanctions tend to have this longer-term effect. They are undoubtedly slowing down the country's industrial development, warping the war's warping the economy. There's a much greater reliance on China that I think is, for the Russian elites generally, is unwelcome. So Putin has effectively maneuvered the country, into a very uncomfortable and indeed unsustainable position. So Trump, may not be the best informed person when it comes to, analyzing Russia's capabilities, but I think he instinctively feels, politically, Putin's got a problem here. So surely he would like to get out of this mess, and I've given him a chance to do that. So why is he not doing it? So I think he's now, having to encounter some harsh reality here. But at the end of the day, we don't know who is advising him, how much on Russia, how much attention he pays to the conversations he's had with NATO allies, to what extent that NATO summit made in The Hague a couple of weeks ago made an impression on him. Trump seemed to be in an extraordinarily good mood there, by the way, at the NATO summit, maybe because he'd strong-armed the European or the non-US allies into coughing up to pay much more for defense. But maybe somebody like Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, really does have his ear. We just don't know. But it feels to me as though something really is starting to change in the way Trump thinks about Russia and the role that Putin is playing in this war.
And meanwhile, Russia seems to be having some of its own quite dramatic political turmoil at the moment. Just yesterday, Russian Transport Minister Roman Starovoyt reportedly shot himself dead after being fired. It's far from the first time high-ranking Russian officials have died in shocking circumstances. What do we know about what's happened here?
No, it's certainly not. We've seen a string of people falling off balconies and out of windows and other things. But the case of Roman Starovoyt, the Minister of Transport up until yesterday, is very significant because it's actually connected to Ukraine. Because between 2018 and 2024, he was the governor of Kursk region, which last summer was invaded by Ukraine in a surprise attack. And the defenses, which had supposedly been fortifications that had been put in place in Kursk region after the start of the war, proved to be absent. And naturally, an investigation on the Russian side began into why money allocated for the purposes of building fortifications had not been invested properly and had probably gone into bureaucrats' pockets or into other things. So the governor who replaced Starovoyt, he is in jail at the moment on some corruption charges, and I suspect something similar was coming the way of Starovoyt himself. So did he commit suicide? We just don't know. But he was probably looking at a potentially quite lengthy jail term if he'd been found guilty. And the way the Russian court system works, if you're charged with an offence like that as an official, there's probably a pretty good chance you're going to end up behind bars. And there's a case certainly of one Russian general recently who received, I think, a 13-year jail sentence on some embezzlement charges, and as somebody who was in fact a hero of Russia, had that sort of status in the armed forces, and yet they're not immune to this sort of investigation. So I think in Starovoyt's case, that probably explains what the nature of the problem was. But for somebody to receive their news they've been fired as transportation minister, and obviously criminal charges piling up, it was unexpected that he should die in this way.
And as you mentioned there, it's not the only suspicious death of a quite high-ranking person in the Russian elite. Earlier this week as well, Andrei Badalov, vice president of Transneft, which is an oil company largely owned by the Russian government, he was found dead after a fall from a building he lived in. It's not known how this happened, but when and why do Russian oil executives and the like tend to die under these sort of suspicious circumstances?
It's a bizarre situation, and it's very difficult to offer an explanation here beyond the fact that this is a dirty business, and Badalov was working for Transneft, which operates the pipeline system, in fact, in the country, and therefore is responsible for quotas of oil, which are then exported. And I don't know to what extent he might have been caught up in some form of illegal business. It's perfectly possible, although he appeared to be, from the accounts I read, responsible for modernizing digital systems in the company. It didn't seem to be handing out quotas directly. So who knows whether it was a signal to somebody he was allied with, but the death most certainly looks suspicious. And you're right. There have been other senior executives from I think Gazprom's, from some other Russian companies who've also, over the last 3 years, died in mysterious circumstances, and not just in Russia, by the way. There was certainly one family that died in Spain, I believe. And the assumption there is that the Russian executive, the father in his family, had shot his wife and children and then turned a gun on himself. But I simply don't have the information to be able to judge what might be going on here. But all one can observe is that there seems to be a very relatively large proportion of people dying in suspicious circumstances, and that suggests that all is not well in that domain.
And elsewhere, just yesterday, gold tycoon Konstantin Strukov was banned from leaving Russia and purportedly had his assets seized by the FSB. Strukov was very much, from what I've read, an ally of Putin. How has he ended up seemingly on the wrong side of the Kremlin, do you think?
Very hard, again, to know the precise reason for this, but he had acquired this gold company on the cheap when it went bankrupt some decades ago, I believe, then built it up and became, in his own right, pretty wealthy. One account I read suggested that he was worth, personally had wealth of about a couple of $billion, which is, really quite significant here by Russian standards. And it may just be that somebody had decided that he'd profited enough from that business, he'd done well enough, and that he needed to share the proceeds elsewhere. That's very often the case in these states that have strong mafia elements to them. So it rather feels though he might have got caught up in something like that. You're absolutely right. He was perceived as an ally of the Kremlin. He was in fact sanctioned by the UK, I believe, after the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine just over 3 years ago. And he was also a member of a regional assembly and part of the United Russia Party, the Kremlin's political party, if one can call it that, a political movement. So he, in many ways, seemed to be, on side with the authorities. But when we talk about the authorities, there are different groups within them, competing interests. And the Kremlin is not always in a position to referee these competitions that take place between business people and business groups, and it's quite likely that he again got caught up in something that just sort of spiraled out of control, and then he's suddenly another statistic.
What do these events say about the way that Putin's Russia operates under these sort of wartime situation it's found itself in?
Well, we can see that there's been a real tightening of control because the country is at war. The elites are the people around Putin, many cases those who work with him over 20 years or more. Some of those people are getting old. Some are being replaced. There's some new blood being brought in. And it does seem that Putin is probably preparing for the fact that he will leave office in the coming years. And he's trying to set up a system that's not going to go after him when he leaves power. So there are people being brought in, I would say, family connections, people who can be very much trusted. So that process is taking place at the same time as within the country. A chunk of the business elite has not done well as a result of the war because of sanctions, having to divert to other markets, the economic pain that's been piled on the country. Those people lost out, and yet there are others within the system who have gained because of the high-level investment, for example, in the defense industry and other related branches of industry. So within the Russian system, despite this imposition of control, particularly on society and very sort of repressive machinery working, as far as we can tell, quite effectively, you've got movement within the system itself. And I think that may be creating some challenges. And just because of the way the decision-making system in Russia functions, it's so top down, so centralized, it's difficult to control everything. And when Putin's also trying to fight a war, not particularly successfully, by the way, this is consuming a lot of bandwidth. So I suspect that there are people with a sense that they can play a little bit around the edges and seek opportunity in these conditions, but it's a perilous game.
Well, John Lough, it's a lot of interesting developments going on there, and it doesn't sound like it's the end of it. So I'm sure we'll have you on again soon. John, Head of Foreign Policy at the new Eurasian Strategies Centre, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Pleasure, Louis. Great to talk with you. Thank you.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.